The organ music swells through St. Mary's Cathedral as I watch my family weep for a monster. From my seat in the third pew, I can see Uncle Robert's casket draped in white lilies, those same flowers he used to bring Aunt Margaret every Sunday after church. How fitting that they'd choose something so pure to cover something so rotten. He was such a wonderful man, my cousin Jennifer sobs into her husband's shoulder. The best father anyone could ask for. I bite the inside of my cheek until I taste copper. 72 years old, and I still can't stop that familiar metallic taste from rising in my throat when people praise Robert Martinez. Even now, with his cold body finally silenced forever, his ghost still has the power to make my stomach churn. My daughter Sarah squeezes my hand. "Are you okay, Mom? You look pale." I nod, not trusting my voice. How do I explain that I'm better than I've been in decades? That for the first time since I was 8 years old, I can sleep without wondering if he's still out there, watching, waiting, remembering what we shared in that house on Maple Street. The priest drones on about Robert's devotion to family, his commitment to the community. Behind me, I hear his grandson Michael crying, the same little boy who's now 35 and delivering one of the eulogies. I remember when Michael was born, how my heart nearly stopped watching Robert hold that tiny baby. How I'd called Jennifer 3 times that first week, making excuses to check on them, listening desperately for any sign in her voice that something was wrong. Nothing ever was. At least, not with Michael. He coached my little league team for 6 years, Michael says from the podium now, his voice breaking. Never missed a practice, never raised his voice. He taught me that being a man meant protecting the people you love. The irony burns like acid in my chest. I glance around at the packed cathedral, neighbors, church members, former co-workers, all here to celebrate the life of St. Robert. If they only knew what he protected us from was himself, and he didn't even do that. My therapist, Dr. Chen, prepared me for this moment. Eleanor, she'd said during our session last week, his death might bring up complicated feelings. It's normal to feel relief alongside grief, even if the grief isn't for him but for everything else his presence in your life represented. Relief. Such a small word for the weight that's lifted from my shoulders. For 64 years, I've carried the secret of what happened in that house, what he did when Aunt Margaret worked her night shifts at the hospital, what he watched through that keyhole he drilled in my bedroom door. I've carried it through marriage, motherhood, grandmotherhood. Carried it through every family gathering where I had to smile and hug him and pretend we shared normal uncle-niece memories. He was everyone's safe harbor, Jennifer continues, wiping her eyes. Whenever we had problems, Dad was there. He never judged, never turned anyone away. I almost laugh, but it comes out as a choked sound that makes Sarah look at me with concern. Safe harbor. He was a predator who perfected the art of hiding in plain sight, who used his reputation as a family man like armor, protecting himself while he destroyed the child I used to be. The worst part is that they're not lying. Robert was all of those things, to them. He coached Little League and helped with homework and fixed broken faucets and remembered birthdays. He was the uncle who gave the best Christmas presents, who taught the boys how to throw a curveball, who walked Jennifer down the aisle when her biological father couldn't be found. He was also the uncle who made an 8-year-old girl learn that love and violation could come from the same hands. After the service, the family gathers at Jennifer's house. I stand in her kitchen, watching the familiar ritual of a family in mourning, casseroles appearing, coffee brewing, photo albums emerging. Sarah brings me a cup of tea and sits beside me at the breakfast bar. "You've been quiet all day," she says softly. "I know you and Uncle Robert had your differences over the years." Differences. If only it were that simple. "Mom?" Sarah's voice carries a note of worry I've heard too often over the years, the concern of a daughter who's always sensed something broken in her mother but never understood what. I look at my beautiful girl, now 43 with teenagers of her own, and feel the familiar stab of guilt. How much of my damage did I pass down to her? How many moments of connection did we lose because I couldn't explain why I flinched at unexpected touches, why I checked and double-checked every lock in our house, why I never let her stay overnight at relatives' houses. "I'm fine, sweetheart," I lie, the same lie I've told for decades. But as I watch Robert's grandchildren share stories about their beloved grandfather, I realize something has shifted. The fear that has lived in my bones for 64 years is finally quiet. He can't hurt anyone anymore. Maybe it's time to stop protecting his memory and start protecting his victims. Maybe it's finally time to tell the truth. I was 8 years old when my world crumbled the first time. Mom and Dad's screaming matches had become as regular as Sunday Mass, but I never expected to come home from school to find Dad's suitcases by the front door and Mom crying at the kitchen table with divorce papers spread before her like a tarot reading of our family's doom. "Eleanor needs stability," Mom said to Aunt Margaret over the phone that same evening, her voice hollow. "Robert's so good with children, and you have that big house. It'll just be temporary, until I can figure things out." I remember pressing my ear to the hallway wall, trying to understand why temporary felt so permanent, why Mom wouldn't meet my eyes when she tucked me into bed that night. Uncle Robert arrived the next morning in his pristine blue Buick, wearing his Sunday best even though it was Wednesday. He ruffled my hair and called me "little princess," promising ice cream and bedtime stories. Aunt Margaret fussed over my small suitcase, already planning how to redecorate the guest room to make it perfect for our Eleanor. The house on Maple Street looked like something from a magazine. White picket fence, rose bushes flanking the front steps, and Uncle Robert's perfectly manicured lawn that he watered every evening at 6 o'clock sharp. Inside, everything gleamed, Aunt Margaret's pride and joy. Crystal figurines lined the mantel, and plastic runners protected the carpet in high-traffic areas. "House rules are simple," Uncle Robert explained as he carried my suitcase upstairs. "Be respectful, be truthful, and remember that Aunt Margaret works very hard to keep this place nice." His hand was warm on my shoulder as he guided me to what would become my room. "We're going to take real good care of you, Eleanor. You'll see." Those first weeks felt like living in a fairy tale. Uncle Robert helped with my arithmetic homework every night, his cologne filling the space between us as he leaned over my shoulder to check my work. He volunteered to drive me to school and pick me up, waving at the other parents like the devoted guardian he appeared to be. "Your uncle's a saint," Mrs. Patterson from next door would tell Aunt Margaret over the garden fence. Taking in Eleanor like that, and him already so busy with church committee and coaching the boys' baseball team. Saint Robert. That's what everyone called him, though never to his face. He was too modest for such praise. He fixed Mrs. Chen's front steps without being asked. He organized the church food drive every Thanksgiving. He remembered the birthdays of every child in our neighborhood and always had spare baseball gloves for kids whose families couldn't afford them. I wanted to love him the way everyone else did. In those early months, I tried so hard to be grateful, to be the perfect niece who deserved such kindness. When he suggested I call him Uncle Daddy, since my real father had abandoned me, I practiced the words until they felt natural. When he bought me new dresses, always with buttons down the back that I couldn't reach, I twirled in front of the mirror and thanked him properly, the way Aunt Margaret taught me. The first time I noticed something was wrong, I was taking a bath. The water had grown cold, and I was reaching for the towel when I heard it, a small sound from the other side of the wall. Like breathing, but not quite. I sat very still in the lukewarm water, listening, but the sound stopped. "Did you have a nice bath, sweetie?" Uncle Robert asked when I emerged from the bathroom, his smile as warm as ever. I nodded, but something in his eyes made my stomach feel funny. Like when you're on a swing and go too high too fast. The bedroom door was the next thing I noticed. It had a lock, but Uncle Robert explained that locks weren't necessary in a family home. "We don't keep secrets from each other here," he said, removing the small mechanism with his toolbox. "Besides, what if there was an emergency and we needed to get to you quickly?" That made sense. Uncle Robert was always thinking ahead, always protecting us. When he drilled a small hole in the door, for ventilation, he explained, I didn't question it. The hole was barely visible, just a tiny circle near the old keyhole that didn't work anyway. It wasn't until months later, when I was getting dressed after my bath and caught a glimpse of movement in that small, dark circle, that I understood. By then, it was too late. By then, I had already learned to love my captor, to depend on the very person who was stealing pieces of my childhood through a hole the size of a dime. But I was 8 years old, and I didn't have words for what I was learning about trust and violation. I only knew that something that felt wrong was being called love, and that everyone else thought Uncle Robert was the most wonderful man alive. Looking back now with 7 decades of life experience and 2 years of therapy under my belt, I can see Uncle Robert's manipulation with crystal clarity. At the time, I was just a confused child who thought the growing knot in my stomach was normal, that every little girl felt sick when her guardian smiled at her in that particular way. He was methodical in his grooming, though I wouldn't learn that word until I was 43 and watching a documentary about predators with Sarah. The methodical way he isolated me started so subtly that even Aunt Margaret didn't notice at first. Eleanor seems to be having trouble adjusting, he'd tell her when I couldn't finish my dinner, my appetite disappearing as his attention intensified. The divorce really affected her. Maybe we should keep her home more often, help her feel secure. When I stopped playing with the neighborhood kids, not because I didn't want to, but because Uncle Robert always found reasons why I needed to stay close to home, he spun it as separation anxiety. When I became quiet in school, he convinced my teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, that I was processing trauma from my parents' split. Robert's been so patient with her, I overheard Aunt Margaret telling her sister over coffee. He says these things take time, that we need to be extra gentle with Eleanor right now. Extra gentle. The irony still makes my hands shake. Uncle Robert's public persona was flawless armor. Every Tuesday evening, he coached the St. Mary's youth baseball team. Every Saturday, he volunteered at the church food bank. When old Mr. Kowalski next door had his heart attack, Uncle Robert mowed his lawn for 3 months without being asked. He was the first to donate when the Peterson family's house burned down, the first to volunteer for every church committee that needed reliable hands. That man's going straight to heaven, Father Martinez would say, and the congregation would nod in agreement. At the same time, he was carefully rewriting my reality at home. When I started having nightmares and wet the bed, something that hadn't happened since I was 4, he used it as evidence that I was troubled. He'd change my sheets with exaggerated patience, sighing just loud enough for Aunt Margaret to hear. Poor little thing, she'd whisper to him. It's not her fault. Children from broken homes often regress. Broken home. That phrase followed me everywhere, Uncle Robert's explanation for every change in my behavior. When I stopped eating his favorite meals, I was acting out because of my broken home. When I cried during his special hugs that lasted too long, I was confused about appropriate affection because of my broken home. When I started hiding in the basement after school instead of doing homework in the living room where he could supervise, I was withdrawing because of my broken home. The basement became my sanctuary for exactly 3 weeks. Then Uncle Robert discovered my hiding place and explained to Aunt Margaret that isolation was unhealthy for a child dealing with abandonment issues. We need to keep Eleanor close, he said, installing new rules about where I could and couldn't go unsupervised. She needs to feel part of this family. Part of this family meant sitting next to him during evening television, his hand resting on my knee in a way that seemed paternal to anyone watching. It meant helping him with yard work on weekends, just the 2 of us, while Aunt Margaret took her afternoon naps. It meant bedtime stories that grew longer and more intimate, his voice dropping to a whisper as he sat too close to my bed. This is our special time, Eleanor, he'd say, and I learned that special could be a word that made your skin crawl. When I finally tried to tell Aunt Margaret, not about the watching or the touching, because I didn't have words for those things yet, but about how Uncle Robert made me feel scared, she looked at me with disappointment that cut deeper than any physical pain he'd caused. Eleanor Marie, I'm ashamed of you, she said, her voice sharp with anger. Your uncle has opened his home to you, treats you like his own daughter, and this is how you repay his kindness. By telling lies. That night, Uncle Robert came to my room after Aunt Margaret fell asleep. He sat on the edge of my bed and spoke in that gentle voice that fooled everyone except me. "I know you're confused, sweetheart," he said, his hand stroking my hair. "Sometimes children who come from broken families don't understand what real love looks like. But I'm going to keep loving you anyway, even when you say hurtful things about me." I learned that night that telling the truth could make things worse. I learned that some lies were so well constructed that they became more believable than reality. Most importantly, I learned that I was completely, terrifyingly alone in a house full of people who loved my abuser more than they could ever love me. At 8 years old, I stopped fighting and started surviving. By the time I turned 13, I had perfected the art of disappearing while still being present. My body learned to go somewhere else during Uncle Robert's lessons about becoming a woman, while my mind catalogued escape routes and counted ceiling tiles and recited multiplication tables until the moments passed. The hole in my bedroom door had been joined by others, tiny openings that appeared in the bathroom wall, in the closet where I changed clothes. Uncle Robert called them improvements when Aunt Margaret asked, claiming he was installing better ventilation throughout the house. She praised his handiwork, never questioning why all these improvements seemed centered around spaces where I spent time alone. High school brought new challenges. My body was changing in ways that made Uncle Robert's attention more intense, more dangerous. He started commenting on my development during our family dinners, disguising his observations as paternal concern. "Eleanor's becoming quite the young lady," he'd say to Aunt Margaret, his eyes lingering on my chest in a way that made my skin crawl. "We need to make sure she understands how to dress appropriately. Some girls her age send the wrong message without realizing it." This became his justification for monitoring my clothes, for insisting on shopping trips where he selected my outfits while Aunt Margaret waited in the car. Everything had to be approved by Uncle Robert. Too tight was inappropriate, too loose was sloppy, too bright would attract the wrong kind of attention. "Your uncle only wants what's best for you," Aunt Margaret would say when I protested. "He's protecting you from boys who might get the wrong idea." The irony was suffocating. The only person I needed protection from was the one everyone trusted to protect me. My grades began to slip. Not dramatically enough to raise alarms, but enough that my straight A's became B's and C's. I couldn't concentrate during tests, couldn't focus on homework when every sound in the house made me freeze, listening for his footsteps. Sleep became elusive as I learned to stay awake until I heard him snoring through the walls, finally allowing myself rest only when I knew he wouldn't be visiting my room. Mrs. Kowalski, my English teacher, kept me after class one day in October of my junior year. "Eleanor, is everything all right at home?" she asked, her voice gentle but probing. "You seem distant lately. Your essay quality has declined, and you fall asleep in class more often than I'd like to see." For a moment, I felt the dangerous flutter of hope. Here was an adult asking the right questions, someone who might listen, might believe me. The words crowded in my throat, all the things I'd never been able to say, all the truth I'd swallowed for 5 years. "I'm just tired," I heard myself say instead. "Aunt Margaret's been working extra shifts, so I help more around the house." Mrs. Kowalski nodded sympathetically. "That's very mature of you. Your uncle mentioned how responsible you've become when he came to parent-teacher conferences. He's very proud of you." Uncle Robert at parent-teacher conferences. Uncle Robert, who made sure every teacher knew what a devoted guardian he was, how much he sacrificed for his troubled niece from a broken home. Uncle Robert, who volunteered for every school function, who helped build sets for drama productions, who donated prizes for fundraising events. Saint Robert, whose reputation was so sterling that my teacher saw his presence at school as evidence of his care rather than his control. That night, I stared at my reflection in the bathroom mirror and barely recognized the hollow-eyed girl staring back. My hip bones jutted out sharply. Food had become another casualty of my survival strategy. If I was thinner, smaller, maybe I could disappear entirely. Maybe I could become so insignificant that even Uncle Robert would lose interest. I started cutting my arms with a razor blade I stole from his shaving kit. The physical pain was clean, controllable, mine. Unlike everything else in my life, the cutting belonged to me. I could decide when, where, how much. The scars I could hide under long sleeves were proof that I still existed, that some part of me was fighting back, even if it was only against myself. "Eleanor's been moody lately," I heard Uncle Robert tell Aunt Margaret one evening. "It's normal for girls her age. All those hormones. We just need to be patient with her." Moody. As if my withdrawal, my silence, my desperate attempts to become invisible were typical teenage rebellion rather than trauma responses. As if the dark circles under my eyes were from staying up too late talking to friends rather than from lying awake in terror. I began making plans. College applications became my lifeline, my secret project. I researched schools far away, calculated exactly how many scholarships and student loans I'd need to escape. I worked every odd job I could find, babysitting for neighbors, helping at the church food bank, anything that kept me away from the house and earned me money toward freedom. Uncle Robert didn't like my new schedule. "Family should come first," he'd say when I left for work. "Don't forget where your loyalties should lie, Eleanor." But I had already decided where my loyalties lay, with the scared, broken girl in the mirror who deserved better than this. With the future woman I hoped to become, if I could just survive long enough to meet her. Senior year became my countdown to freedom. Every day I crossed off my calendar felt like a small victory against the man who had stolen 9 years of my childhood. I had been accepted to Northwestern University with a partial scholarship, not enough to cover everything, but combined with student loans and the money I'd saved from my various jobs, it would get me to Illinois. 3 states away from Uncle Robert. 3 states away from that house on Maple Street and its terrible secrets. I hadn't told anyone about my acceptance yet. The letter lived in my chemistry textbook, pressed between pages about molecular bonds and chemical reactions, fitting metaphors for how I planned to break free from the toxic compound that was my life with Uncle Robert. The night I finally told them, Aunt Margaret was washing dishes while Uncle Robert read his evening paper. I stood in the kitchen doorway, my acceptance letter trembling in my hands like a peace treaty I was afraid to sign. "I got into Northwestern," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Aunt Margaret dropped the plate she was washing. It shattered against the porcelain sink, and for a moment, the sound of breaking seemed to fill the entire house. "College?" she asked, turning to face me with sudsy hands. "Eleanor, honey, we never discussed college. You know money's tight, and there's so much you can do right here. Mrs. Patterson needs help at the flower shop, and I have scholarships," I interrupted, something I'd never done before in that house. "And loans. I can work while I'm there. I've figured it all out." Uncle Robert slowly folded his newspaper. The deliberate way he creased each edge told me everything I needed to know about his mood. When he looked at me, his smile was the same warm expression that had fooled everyone for nearly a decade. "Eleanor, sweetheart, this is very sudden," he said, his tone reasonable, loving even. "College is a big decision. There are a lot of things to consider: safety, finances, whether you're really ready to be on your own. You've been through so much with your parents' divorce. Sometimes girls from broken homes struggle with independence." There it was again, the broken home defense, my psychological damage as justification for his control. "I'm 18, I said, surprised by the steadiness in my own voice. "I can make this decision myself." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Uncle Robert's smile never wavered, but something shifted behind his eyes, something dangerous and possessive that I'd seen too many times before. "Of course you can," he said softly. "But family takes care of family. We love you, Eleanor. Don't you think you owe us some consideration after everything we've done for you?" The guilt hit like a physical blow. 9 years of conditioning kicked in, the voice that told me I was ungrateful, selfish, that I owed them my life because they'd taken me in when my own parents couldn't handle me. But then I thought about the acceptance letter, about Professor Williams from the admissions office who had called me a promising young woman with a bright future. I thought about dormitories with locks that worked, about roommates who didn't know my history, about becoming someone other than the broken girl from the broken home. "I'm going," I said. Over the following weeks, Uncle Robert launched a campaign more subtle and devastating than any war strategy. He didn't forbid me from leaving, that would have made him look unreasonable. Instead, he orchestrated a series of obstacles designed to make departure impossible. First, he convinced Aunt Margaret to accidentally misplace my birth certificate and Social Security card, documents I needed for financial aid processing. When I finally retrieved copies from the county office, he discovered that my college fund, money I'd earned and saved for 3 years, had somehow been mixed in with household expenses during a particularly difficult month. "I'm so sorry, sweetheart," he said, his face the picture of regret. "Margaret and I will pay it back as soon as we can, but right now, with her medical bills." Aunt Margaret had no medical bills. But Uncle Robert's ability to create believable emergencies was masterful. He scheduled family obligations during every college preparation deadline. Suddenly, elderly relatives needed visits, church events required my participation, and household crises demanded my immediate attention. When I missed a scholarship interview because Aunt Margaret had a migraine and needed care, Uncle Robert shook his head sadly. "Maybe this is a sign, Eleanor. Maybe you're not meant to leave family behind." But I had learned something during those 9 years of survival. I was stronger than he wanted me to believe. I rewrote essays in library bathrooms, completed loan applications during lunch breaks, and made phone calls to the financial aid office from payphones when he was at work. The day my final loan approval came through, I knew I had won. Uncle Robert might have stolen my childhood, but he wouldn't steal my future. 3 months later, I loaded everything I owned into 2 suitcases and walked out of that house forever. As his car disappeared in the rearview mirror of the taxi taking me to the bus station, I felt something I hadn't experienced in 9 years: hope. Freedom, I discovered, was terrifying. My first night in the Northwestern dormitory, I lay awake staring at the door, a door with a working lock, a door I could secure from the inside. My roommate, Jessica, a cheerful girl from Wisconsin who collected stuffed animals and talked constantly about her high school boyfriend, had fallen asleep hours ago. But I couldn't stop listening for footsteps in the hallway, couldn't stop checking that tiny peephole to make sure no one was watching from the other side. "You okay over there?" Jessica mumbled around 3 a.m. when she caught me testing the door lock for the 4th time. "Just making sure it's secure," I whispered back, feeling foolish but unable to stop myself. She laughed sleepily. "Eleanor, we're on the 3rd floor. Nobody's breaking in here except maybe Spider-Man." If only she knew that the monsters I feared didn't need to break in, they convinced you to let them in, then made you believe you deserved whatever they did to you. The first panic attack hit during my introduction to psychology class. Professor Daniels was discussing childhood development when she mentioned something about inappropriate adult relationships with children. The fluorescent lights suddenly seemed too bright, the room too small, and I couldn't breathe. I bolted from the lecture hall, leaving my backpack behind, and found myself vomiting in the bathroom while my heart hammered against my ribs. "Panic disorder," Dr. Matthews at the campus health center explained after I finally worked up the courage to seek help 3 weeks later. "It's more common than you think, especially in students adjusting to college life." I didn't tell her about Uncle Robert. I told myself I didn't need to, that leaving him 3 states away would be enough, that I could outrun the damage he'd done simply by putting distance between us. I was wrong. Dating was impossible. When Brad from my literature class asked me to see a movie, I agreed because Jessica said I should get out there and have fun. But when he put his arm around me in the dark theater, my skin felt like it was on fire. When he walked me back to my dorm and leaned in for a goodnight kiss, I shoved him away so hard he stumbled backward. Jesus, Eleanor, what's wrong with you? He asked, more confused than angry. I couldn't explain that his cologne reminded me of Uncle Robert's, that his hand on my shoulder triggered memories of other hands in places they shouldn't have been. I couldn't explain that his perfectly normal, college boy interest in me felt predatory because I'd learned to associate male attention with danger. I'm sorry, I managed. I can't. Word spread quickly in our small liberal arts program. Eleanor Martinez was weird, damaged, frigid. Boys stopped asking me out, which was both a relief and a confirmation of everything Uncle Robert had ever told me, that I was broken, that normal relationships weren't for girls like me. My salvation came in the form of Professor Margaret Chen, who taught advanced developmental psychology. She was young for a professor, maybe early 30s, with kind eyes and a direct way of speaking that reminded me nothing of Uncle Robert's manipulative gentleness. After I turned in my midterm paper on trauma responses in children, a topic I researched with obsessive thoroughness, she asked me to stay after class. Eleanor, this is exceptional work, she said, holding up my paper. Your understanding of complex trauma is remarkably sophisticated for an undergraduate. Have you considered psychology as a major? I had been studying English, thinking I'd become a teacher like Mrs. Kowalski, the only adult who had ever seemed to notice my distress, even if she hadn't been able to help. I find the subject interesting, I said carefully. Professor Chen studied me for a long moment. Would you like to work as my research assistant next semester? I'm studying resilience factors in trauma survivors. I think you might have valuable insights. That conversation changed everything. Working with Professor Chen, I learned the vocabulary for what had happened to me. Grooming. Psychological manipulation. Complex post-traumatic stress disorder. For the first time, I had clinical terms for the chaos in my head, scientific explanations for why I jumped when someone touched me unexpectedly, why I couldn't sleep without checking locks multiple times, why intimacy felt impossible. Trauma responses are adaptive, Professor Chen explained during one of our research sessions. Your hypervigilance, your difficulty with trust, these weren't character flaws. They were survival mechanisms that kept you safe in an unsafe situation. It was during my junior year that I met David. He was a graduate student in the philosophy department, quiet and thoughtful, with gentle hands and a patient smile. When I flinched away from his first attempt to hold my hand, he didn't push or demand explanations. We can go as slow as you need, he said simply. I'm not going anywhere. It took 6 months for me to let him kiss me. A year before I could let him hold me without my entire body tensing up. 2 years before I told him, in broken whispers during a thunderstorm that kept us both awake, about Uncle Robert and the house on Maple Street. David cried that night, for me, for the child I'd been, for the innocence that had been stolen. But he didn't look at me differently afterward. He didn't treat me like I was broken or damaged or dangerous. You survived, he said, his arms steady around me. You got out, and you're building a life. You're the strongest person I know. For the first time since I was 8 years old, I began to believe that might be true. David proposed on a quiet Sunday morning in our graduate school apartment, no fanfare or grand gestures, just coffee and toast and a simple ring that had belonged to his grandmother. When I said yes, I meant it with every part of my healing heart, but even as I kissed him, a small voice whispered that I was cheating him somehow, that he was marrying damaged goods without knowing the full extent of the damage. We married the summer after graduation in a small ceremony at his family's church in Ohio. Uncle Robert and Aunt Margaret came, of course. David had insisted on inviting my family, and I couldn't explain why that made my stomach churn without revealing everything. Watching Uncle Robert shake David's hand and welcome him to the family felt like swallowing glass. He looked older but no less charming, still playing the role of the devoted uncle who had sacrificed so much for his troubled niece. Eleanor looks radiant, he told David during the reception, his hand briefly touching my shoulder in a gesture that looked paternal to anyone watching. I'm so proud of the young woman she's become, despite everything she's been through. despite everything she's been through. As if my childhood trauma was something that had happened to me rather than something he had done to me. I became a teacher first, then a librarian, drawn to environments where I could protect children without having to explain my intense vigilance. At Jefferson Elementary, I was known as the teacher who noticed everything, which child seemed unusually quiet, who flinched when adults moved too quickly, whose drawings contained disturbing themes that other teachers dismissed as creative. Sometimes I was wrong. Sometimes I saw signs of abuse in perfectly normal childhood behavior because Uncle Robert had taught me that danger could hide behind the most ordinary interactions. But sometimes I was right, and my hypervigilance saved children from situations their parents or other teachers hadn't recognized. Mrs. Martinez has a gift for connecting with troubled students, Principal Williams wrote in my evaluation. If only she knew that my gift came from recognizing myself in their frightened faces. When Sarah was born, I held my daughter and made promises I wasn't sure I could keep. I would protect her from everything that had happened to me. I would never let anyone hurt her the way Uncle Robert had hurt me. I would be the mother I'd needed during those dark years on Maple Street. But hypervigilance is exhausting, and raising a child while carrying unprocessed trauma is like trying to nurture a garden while fighting off invisible wolves. I checked on Sarah obsessively, 10-15 times a night when she was a baby, creeping to her crib to make sure she was still breathing, still safe, still mine. David noticed, of course. He noticed everything, how I insisted on interviewing every babysitter like they were applying for the CIA, how I refused to let Sarah sleep over at friends' houses, how I tensed up whenever his brother or male friends held our daughter. "Eleanor, she's safe," he'd say gently when he found me standing guard outside her bedroom door at 2 a.m. "We live in a good neighborhood. Our friends are good people. You can't protect her from everything." But he was wrong. I couldn't protect her from everything, but I could try to protect her from the specific evil I knew existed in the world. The evil that smiled and coached Little League and brought flowers to church, the evil that everyone loved until it was too late. Family gatherings became elaborate performances. Uncle Robert would hold court at reunions and holiday dinners, regaling everyone with stories about my childhood, painting himself as the patient father figure who'd helped a broken little girl heal from her parents' divorce. "Remember how shy you used to be?" he'd say, his eyes meeting mine across the dinner table. "You barely spoke for months after you came to live with us. But we never gave up on you, did we?" I would smile and nod and agree with his version of history while Sarah played with her cousins and David chatted with my relatives about work and weather. No one knew that I spent these gatherings in a state of constant alertness, watching Uncle Robert's interactions with every child present, ready to intervene at the first sign of inappropriate behavior. The hardest part was that he seemed genuinely reformed, or perhaps simply too old and aware of his mortality to risk new victims. But I couldn't trust that reformation, couldn't relax my guard, because I knew what he was capable of beneath that grandfatherly exterior. "Mom, you're being weird again," Sarah would tell me when she was old enough to notice my behavior at family events. "Uncle Robert is nice. Why do you always act so strange around him? How do you explain to your 8-year-old daughter that the man who brings her birthday presents and tells her funny stories is the same man who stole your childhood? How do you teach her about stranger danger when the real danger might come from someone everyone trusts?" I couldn't tell her the truth, so I told her half-truths instead. I taught her about body autonomy and inappropriate touching without explaining why I knew so much about these topics. I role-played scenarios about what to do if someone made her uncomfortable, using clinical language that she absorbed like gospel. "Sarah's very mature for her age," the other mothers would comment. "So aware, so cautious." They meant it as a compliment, not knowing that I was raising my daughter to be as vigilant as I was, passing down my trauma like a family heirloom I couldn't bear to keep but couldn't bear to throw away. By my 40th birthday, the weight of carrying Uncle Robert's secret had carved deep grooves into my marriage that I couldn't explain and David couldn't understand. We'd been together for nearly 20 years, but there were parts of me that remained locked away from him, rooms in my psyche where he wasn't allowed entry because I couldn't risk him seeing what Uncle Robert had left behind. Intimacy became a careful dance of avoidance. I could manage affection, even passion, but only under very specific circumstances: lights off, my body positioned so I could see the door, David's hands only in places that didn't trigger flashbacks. He never complained, but I caught him watching me sometimes with a sadness that broke my heart. He was married to a woman who flinched when he touched her unexpectedly, who couldn't fully abandon herself to love because part of me was always listening for footsteps, always ready to disappear inside myself if necessary. "We should see a counselor," David suggested one evening after I'd pulled away from him for the third time that week. "It might help us understand what's happening." I agreed because I didn't know how to refuse without raising more questions, but every therapy session became an elaborate performance of partial truths. Dr. Rebecca Sullivan was kind and competent, and I told her about my parents' divorce, about feeling abandoned, about trust issues stemming from childhood instability. I gave her everything except the truth about Uncle Robert. "Eleanor seems to have significant trauma responses," I overheard Dr. Sullivan tell David during one of their private sessions. "But she's very resistant to exploring the source. Sometimes childhood abandonment can create these patterns." David tried so hard to understand. He read books about children of divorce, about attachment disorders, about helping partners heal from unspecified trauma. He became expert at recognizing my triggers without knowing what had caused them, learned to approach me like I was a wild animal that might bolt at any sudden movement. The guilt was suffocating. Here was this good man who loved me unconditionally, and I was poisoning our marriage with secrets I couldn't tell, damage I couldn't explain. Some nights I lay awake composing the words in my head: "David, when I was 8 years old, my uncle." But I could never get past those first few words. The shame was too deep, the fear too ingrained. Meanwhile, Sarah was becoming a teenager, and my overprotectiveness was driving a wedge between us that grew wider every year. When she wanted to go to sleepovers, I invented elaborate reasons why she couldn't. When she started dating at 16, I interrogated her boyfriends like they were suspects in a crime that hadn't happened yet. "Mom, you're suffocating me," she screamed during one particularly heated argument about curfew. "You act like every person I meet is a serial killer. It's not normal." She was right, but I couldn't tell her why. How could I explain that I knew what monsters looked like? That they didn't hide in dark alleys, they lived in nice houses with manicured lawns, coached sports teams, and brought flowers to church every Sunday. The anxiety attack started in my early 40s, triggered by seemingly random events. A man in the grocery store who stood too close in line. A movie scene depicting child abuse. Uncle Robert's annual Christmas card, still arriving faithfully every year with a photo of his grandchildren and updates about his wonderful life. Dr. Patricia Hayes, my third therapist in 5 years, was more persistent than the others. "Eleanor, I'm seeing patterns that suggest significant childhood trauma beyond what you've shared with me," she said during our 6th session. "The hypervigilance, the intimacy issues, the specific triggers you've described, these are consistent with survivors of childhood sexual abuse." The words hung in the air like smoke from a fire I'd been trying to contain for 3 decades. I felt exposed, seen, terrified. "I don't know what you mean," I lied. "It's okay," Dr. Hayes said gently. "You don't have to tell me anything you're not ready to share. But I want you to know that whatever happened to you, it wasn't your fault. And healing is possible, even if it feels impossible right now." That night, I stood in Sarah's doorway watching her sleep, thinking about generational patterns and inherited trauma. She was 17, the same age I'd been when I escaped Uncle Robert's house. But unlike me at 17, she was confident, outspoken, unbroken. My hypervigilance had protected her, but it had also taught her to see the world as dangerous in ways that weren't entirely healthy. David found me there at 2 a.m., tears streaming down my face. "Eleanor, what's wrong?" he asked, his voice thick with sleep and concern. "I'm breaking our family," I whispered. "I'm passing down damage I can't even name." He wrapped his arms around me from behind, and for once, I didn't pull away. Then let's figure out how to fix it, he said simply. Whatever it is, we'll figure it out together. I wanted to believe him. But after 32 years of carrying Uncle Robert's poison alone, I wasn't sure I remembered how to trust anyone with the truth, even the man who loved me most. The Martinez family reunion was scheduled for a sweltering Saturday in July at Uncle Robert's house, the same house on Maple Street where my nightmares were born. At 62, I hadn't set foot inside those walls in 45 years, but Jennifer insisted it would mean the world to her father to host one last gathering before he became too frail to manage such events. Too frail. Uncle Robert was 78 but still moved with the confident stride of a man who had never been held accountable for anything. Still charmed everyone who met him. Still made my skin crawl from across a crowded room. "We don't have to stay long," David murmured as we walked up the familiar front steps. Sarah, now 28 and married, carried her 18-month-old daughter Emma on her hip. 3 generations of Martinez women returning to the scene of the crime that only one of us knew had been committed. The house looked exactly the same. Same white picket fence, same perfectly manicured lawn, same rose bushes flanking the entrance. But I was different now, no longer the powerless child who had walked through this door 45 years ago. I was a grown woman with a successful career, a loving family, and enough distance to observe Uncle Robert with clinical detachment. At least, that's what I told myself until I saw him with Emma. "There's my beautiful great-niece," Uncle Robert exclaimed, reaching for Emma with the same gentle smile that had fooled everyone for decades. "Come to great Uncle Robert, sweetheart." Emma, who was usually shy with strangers, went to him without hesitation. She giggled as he bounced her on his knee, playing the doting great-uncle for his appreciative audience. But I saw things the others missed, how his hands lingered on her tiny legs, how he positioned her on his lap, how his eyes held a familiar intensity that made my blood turn to ice. "She loves you, Dad," Jennifer laughed, snapping photos. "You still have the magic touch with children." Magic touch. The phrase hit me like a physical blow. I watched throughout the afternoon as Uncle Robert orchestrated opportunities to be alone with Emma. When she needed a diaper change, he volunteered before Sarah could respond. When she became fussy, he offered to walk her around the house to calm her down. Each time, he disappeared for just a few minutes longer than necessary. "Mom, you're staring," Sarah whispered during dessert. "Is everything okay?" I couldn't explain that I was watching a predator work, seeing patterns I recognized with the clarity of hard-won experience. Emma was too young to be a target for the worst of his behaviors, but Uncle Robert was establishing groundwork, making her comfortable with his touch, positioning himself as her special person, creating opportunities for unsupervised access. The breaking point came when I went looking for the bathroom and found Uncle Robert emerging from what used to be my bedroom, now his quiet room, where he liked to take the babies when they needed to nap. Emma was in his arms, her diaper obviously freshly changed, but something about the scene made every alarm bell in my head scream. "Just getting our little princess settled," he said, that familiar gentle tone that had once made me believe his violations were expressions of love. "She's such a good baby. So trusting." Trusting. The word felt like a threat. That evening, I called Jennifer from our hotel room. My hands shook as I dialed, knowing I was about to detonate a bomb that would destroy relationships and family dynamics that had been carefully constructed over decades. "Jennifer, I need to talk to you about your father." "What about him?" "Eleanor, he's been so excited about today. Seeing Emma just made his whole month. I'm concerned about his behavior with her." The silence on the other end stretched so long I wondered if the call had dropped. "What are you talking about?" Jennifer's voice had gone cold. I took a breath and tried to find words that wouldn't sound insane. "I noticed some things today. The way he insisted on changing her diaper, taking her to private rooms, the way he touches her. It reminds me of patterns I've seen before." "Patterns?" Jennifer's voice was rising. Eleanor, what exactly are you suggesting about my father? I'm suggesting that maybe Emma shouldn't be alone with him. That maybe you should be more careful about. Stop. Jennifer's voice cut through my stammering like a blade. Just stop right there. I don't know what's wrong with you, but I won't listen to this poison about my father. He's the most gentle, loving man I know. He raised me and my brothers with nothing but kindness, and now you're suggesting he's some kind of, what? Child molester. Jennifer, please, just listen. No, you listen. I don't know what your problem is, but you're not going to spread these sick ideas about my family. My father is 78 years old. He's devoted his entire life to his children and grandchildren. And now you want to destroy his reputation with these disgusting accusations. The line went dead. I sat holding the phone, my worst fear confirmed: no one would believe me. Just like when I was 13 and tried to tell Aunt Margaret, Uncle Robert's reputation was unassailable. He had spent 78 years building the perfect facade, and my word against his carefully constructed legacy wasn't enough. But Emma was 18 months old, the same age I'd been when my parents' marriage started falling apart. She had time yet before she'd be old enough for Uncle Robert's particular interests. Time for me to figure out how to protect her. Time for me to finally find my voice, even if it meant destroying everything I'd built my adult life around. The silence in our hotel room after Jennifer hung up was heavier than any grief I'd felt at Robert's funeral. David sat across from me at the small desk, his hands resting on his knees, watching me with the careful stillness of someone who knows a single word might cause a collapse. I hadn't told him yet. Not really. For 34 years of marriage, I'd let him believe in ghosts, shadows of abandonment, whispered trauma, vague emotional landmines. I had never given him a name. I had never said the words. But now there was Emma. I need to tell you something, I said, my voice so low it barely broke the quiet. All of it. Everything I've never told you. David didn't flinch. He only nodded and leaned forward slightly, like he was preparing to catch something fragile that might fall. I couldn't look him in the eyes. Instead, I stared at the edge of the bedspread and began at the beginning, not with the funeral, not with the reunion, but with the night I arrived at the house on Maple Street with a single suitcase and a heart full of fear disguised as hope. I told him about the baths. The holes. The special stories. Aunt Margaret's denial. The locked doors that never locked. The cold terror of living under a man who wore gentleness like armor and cruelty like perfume. I was 8, I whispered. He watched me through the keyhole. Touched me. Taught me to call it love. David's hands trembled where they rested on the desk, but he didn't interrupt. He didn't speak. He only listened, the way someone listens to a confession from a world they've never lived in. When I paused to breathe, he nodded softly for me to continue. And I did. I told him about the nights I stayed awake until I heard snoring. The panic attacks. The cutting. The escape. The long, slow unraveling of my sense of normal. When I finished, my hands were clenched in my lap, nails pressed into palms so tightly I had half-moons etched into the skin. David stood, walked to me, and knelt at my feet. He took my hands in his, gently, like they were porcelain, and kissed each one. I'm so sorry, he said, his voice cracking. I'm so sorry you were alone with that. For so long. I hadn't cried while I told him. Not once. But now, with those words, the tears came. Not the panicked kind that choked you, but slow, quiet weeping, the kind that came when someone finally believed you. The kind that washed years of dust from buried truths. I thought if I told you, you'd see me differently, I said, the words tumbling out now that the dam had broken. Like I was damaged. Like I wasn't enough. You are more than enough, David said, his forehead resting against mine. You are whole in ways I'll never understand. We sat like that for a long time, two people who had lived beside each other for decades and were just now truly meeting. Sarah came by the next morning before breakfast. She brought coffee and a bag of scones and the same worried expression I'd seen on her face since she was a teenager. "Can we talk?" I asked, motioning her toward the chair by the window. David quietly excused himself, leaving us alone. Sarah tucked her legs beneath her and waited. I didn't know how to begin, so I started with Emma. How I'd watched Uncle Robert at the reunion. How I saw familiar patterns. How I'd tried to warn Jennifer. Sarah's face grew still. "I knew something was wrong," she said. "The way you watched him. The way you wouldn't let me near him when I was little. I always thought it was you being overprotective." I admitted. But it wasn't irrational. It wasn't anxiety. It was history. And then I told her. It was harder than telling David. Not because she wouldn't believe me, but because Sarah was the child I had tried so hard to protect without telling her why. I saw the shift in her face as I spoke, love, horror, grief, anger, all flickering across her features like shadows cast by moving light. When I finished, she didn't cry right away. She sat quietly, processing. Then she reached across the space between us and gripped my hand with the strength of someone holding a lifeline. "Mom," she said softly, "you didn't ruin me. I know you've always been afraid of that. But you didn't. You gave me everything you never had. You made me safe even when you weren't." I exhaled a breath I didn't know I'd been holding since the day she was born. "I'm going to make sure Emma is safe too," she added, her voice gaining steel. "Even if Jennifer hates us for it." I nodded. There would be fallout. There would be rage, disbelief, rejection. But there was also truth now, shared, not buried. That evening, I sat alone in the hotel room with a notebook in my lap and the phone beside me. I wrote a letter to Jennifer. Not to convince her, I knew I wouldn't. But to document. To warn. To give her the version of Robert she never saw, in my own words, on my own terms. I didn't know what she'd do with it. Maybe she'd burn it. Maybe she'd hide it. But maybe, one day, when something didn't sit right with Emma, when a touch lingered too long or a joke felt too loaded, maybe Jennifer would remember my words. And maybe she'd listen. Because that's what silence steals, the chance to be heard before it's too late. I had broken the silence. And I was still standing. I didn't walk into the police station with expectations. Hope is a dangerous thing when you've lived long enough to see how easily it shatters. I walked in with something colder than hope, resolve. I had waited 64 years to speak the truth out loud to someone in authority, and even if it came to nothing, even if it never led to a courtroom or handcuffs, I needed this, for Emma, for Sarah, for the girl I used to be. The officer at the front desk was young. Too young. She looked like someone Sarah might have gone to college with, eyes rimmed with fatigue, a ponytail too tight, fingers tapping rapidly on a keyboard before she glanced up at me. I told her I wanted to make a report about a man named Robert Martinez. Her expression didn't change. "Is this something that just happened, ma'am?" she asked, polite but rehearsed. "No," I said. "It started when I was 8 years old." That's when she looked up. There's a particular kind of stillness that enters a room when a survivor speaks for the first time, a subtle shifting of air, like everyone forgets to breathe for a moment. She nodded once and asked me to wait while she got a detective. The man who came out to meet me wore a badge clipped to his belt and skepticism woven into the lines around his mouth. Detective Grayson. He led me to a back room with fluorescent lighting and thin carpet that muffled every footstep. He offered me water, which I declined, and then he sat across from me with a yellow legal pad and a mechanical pencil, both of which remained untouched for most of the next hour. I told him everything. I started with the house on Maple Street, with the keyhole, the watching, the grooming. I spoke of the special bedtime stories, the missing locks, the systematic isolation. I gave him dates, details, names. I described how it escalated. How I escaped. How I'd remained silent until now. Grayson listened, but his posture changed the moment I mentioned that Robert was dead. Just to clarify, he said carefully, the alleged abuser is deceased. Yes. He nodded, and I watched a wall slide into place behind his eyes. I knew that look. It was the look teachers gave when they realized a student was telling the truth but couldn't be helped because there were no visible bruises. It was the look therapists gave when they bumped up against the hard edge of something unspeakable. It was the look of someone who believed but couldn't act. I'm not asking you to arrest a dead man, I said, my voice sharper than I intended. I'm asking for this to be on record. Because I believe he may have started again, with my great-niece. Because I need someone, somewhere, to know who he really was. He scribbled something down then, finally, and I felt the absurd urge to lean over the table and see what he was writing. Maybe just my name. Maybe just the word trauma. I'll file the report, he said. But I have to be honest with you. These cases are difficult even when the suspect is alive. With no physical evidence, no statute of limitations left to pursue, and the death of the accused, he hesitated. There's not much we can do legally. I expected that. What I didn't expect was the strange relief I felt, not that the law couldn't act, but that I'd finally put the truth into the world in a place where it would be recorded, where it couldn't be scrubbed clean by family myth. Before I left, I asked if someone would be following up with Robert's family. Grayson paused. Unless another victim comes forward or there's evidence that a minor is currently at risk, we don't typically launch posthumous investigations. I nodded. And then I gave him Jennifer's number. Just in case. Back at home, life resumed in its usual rhythms, meals, laundry, check-ins with Sarah and the grandkids. But something had shifted in me. I had spoken, and I hadn't shattered. I'd been disbelieved before. That wasn't new. But this time, I wasn't 13 and alone. I had David. I had Sarah. I had language for what had happened, and that language made me dangerous to silence. A week later, my cell phone rang just after dinner. I recognized the number from the precinct. My heart did that thing it used to do in my teenage years when footsteps passed my bedroom door, stuttered, clenched, braced. Mrs. Martinez, the voice on the other end said. This is Detective Grayson. I wanted to inform you that someone else has come forward. For a moment, I couldn't speak. I leaned against the kitchen counter, breath frozen in my throat. She's asked to remain anonymous for now, he continued. But she heard about your report from a relative. Said she wasn't ready to speak until she knew someone else believed what had happened. I closed my eyes. Another one. Not just me. She's a cousin of yours, I believe. Much younger. I thought of the family tree, of the countless times Robert had been surrounded by children, camping trips, Sunday barbecues, Christmases. How many of us had been afraid? How many had learned, like I did, that silence was the only thing that kept you safe? Thank you, I whispered. Thank you for calling. That night, I sat at the kitchen table with David beside me and wrote a new letter, this one to the unnamed cousin who had finally, bravely, said me too. I didn't know if she'd ever read it. But I needed her to know she wasn't alone. In the absence of legal justice, we had each other. We had truth. And now, we had a beginning. The hospice was tucked behind a grove of aging eucalyptus trees, the kind of place meant to smell of lavender and fresh linens instead of decay. It was quiet, almost reverent, with soft lighting and slow footsteps echoing down carpeted halls. I hadn't set foot inside a medical facility in years unless it was for Sarah's deliveries or my own checkups. But this was different. This wasn't about health. This was about what I needed to say before death took away even the pretense of a chance. Robert had been here for 4 days. Jennifer's voice on the phone had been brittle when she told Sarah. He's not in pain, she'd said. He's sleeping most of the time now. Just fading. She'd spoken with such fragile reverence that it almost made me feel cruel for what I planned to do. But not enough to stop me. David offered to drive me, but I declined. This was something I had to do alone. Not because I needed to be brave, I'd done enough surviving in silence to know bravery often looks like shaking hands and shallow breath, but because I didn't want anyone else to witness what this moment might turn into. This wasn't about public reckoning. This was between him and me. The nurse at the front desk checked his room number and gave me a soft, sympathetic smile, mistaking me for a grieving niece saying goodbye to a beloved uncle. I didn't correct her. There was no script for what I was about to do. I walked slowly down the hallway, my footsteps muffled by the carpet, my pulse roaring louder than the air conditioning. His room was dim. A sliver of sunlight slipped past the edge of the curtain, casting a warm line across the white blanket. He looked smaller than I remembered. Age had done to him what no confession ever could, shrunk him. Made him look human. For a moment, I couldn't speak. I stood in the doorway, gripping the handle so tightly my fingers ached. Robert's chest rose and fell in shallow, uneven movements. Machines beeped quietly beside him. His hands, the same ones that had once touched my hair and stolen my innocence, now rested frail and motionless atop the blanket. I stepped inside. Closed the door behind me. He stirred. His eyes fluttered open, pale and watery. For a moment, confusion flickered across his face, then recognition. "Eleanor," he rasped, smiling. "You came." I stood at the foot of the bed. Not close enough for him to reach. Not close enough for his shadow to touch me. "I didn't come for you," I said. "I came for me." He blinked slowly, as though trying to decipher my meaning. "I know what you did," I continued, voice calm and steady. "I've always known. And now so do others." He didn't speak. Just watched me with that same unreadable expression he'd worn my entire childhood, the one that made you question your own perception of things. Jennifer may never believe me. But someone else does. Another survivor. "You didn't stop, did you?" My throat tightened, but I kept going. "You did it again." His face didn't change. Not even a flicker of guilt. "I never touched you inappropriately," he said quietly, the tone still measured, almost offended. "You were a troubled child. We took you in. You had a lot of issues." "Don't," I said sharply, my voice slicing through the room. "Don't you dare use that script with me." He turned his head slightly toward the window, as though tired of the conversation. "I'm dying, Eleanor," he whispered. "I know," I replied. "And I don't care. You won't get to die thinking you fooled everyone. I may not be able to put you in prison, but I've already taken away your silence. That's something." He looked at me then, really looked, and for the first time I thought I saw something crack behind his eyes, not remorse, not fear, but awareness. Recognition that he had lost control of the story. "I loved you," he said, and the words made my stomach lurch. "No," I said, my voice shaking now. "You used me. You isolated me. You violated me. You stole years of my life. That wasn't love. That was power. And you don't get to rewrite that before you go." Silence stretched between us, thicker than the air, heavier than the years. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out something I hadn't touched in decades, an old photograph of me at 9 years old. It had been taken during a church picnic. I was smiling, arms folded tight across my chest. Robert was behind me, a hand resting on my shoulder, his face frozen in an expression the whole community had called benevolent. I placed the photo on his tray table. "That girl doesn't belong to you anymore," I said. "I'm taking her back." I turned to leave. My legs felt heavy, but I didn't falter. At the door, I looked back one last time. Robert had closed his eyes. Whether in dismissal or defeat, I didn't care. I walked out of that hospice lighter than I had walked in. Not healed. Not whole. But released. There was no apology waiting for me in that room, no admission. But I hadn't gone there for him. I'd gone to mark the end of something. To say, "I am not afraid of you anymore." The next morning, Sarah brought Emma over for breakfast. She sat at the table, chubby hands full of scrambled eggs, babbling to herself in that toddler dialect only her mother could understand. I watched her with a kind of awe. She would never know that I had stood face to face with the man who had nearly destroyed me and told him he no longer owned my silence. She would never know how close she had come to the same danger, or how many invisible hands had pushed that danger back. But maybe one day, when she was older, she'd understand what it meant to fight for the right to speak. And maybe she'd find her own voice just a little sooner because of it.